How are you this morning?
I'm fine, thanks. Nice to be here.
And I really appreciate you coming on, and I've been telling the listeners for, probably about 9 months now that you're going to be on any day or any week. So it's great to finally have you on the show, and very much appreciated. Would you like to start off by telling the audience a little bit about yourself, who you are, your educational background, and that sort of thing?
Well, I'm John Allegro's daughter, and my main work is writing and editing as part of Plain Language Commission. In recent years, since his death, I've been looking more into my father's work, leading up to the publication of his biography in 2005, where I was very glad to be able to use the letters and photos and other materials from that he'd prepared at the time that my mother lent me. And the purpose of all that was to really put the record straight about my father, who's had a lot of bad press over the years, rightly or wrongly. So I hope that in my book I was able to put his side of things and say what it was really like at the time, because with hindsight all sorts of criticisms and skewed assessments can work their way in, and I think it's important to go back to the original documents and other records to see what was really happening at the time, which was, in John's case, from the mid-1950s onwards.
And what was it like growing up with a figure like John Allegro? Especially as your father.
Well, to be honest, he wasn't a particularly hands-on father. He was much too busy doing other things, and he did seem a bit remote at times. But we were just conscious of all this extremely clever work going on behind the barrage of books, the encyclopedias and things in his study. And he'd emerge at meal times, and he'd emerge to talk things over with, or talk things at my mother from time to time. But he didn't come around to sharing much of it with me and my brother until much, much later. I'd say in the 1980s, when I used to go over and visit him in his home in Cheshire and talk about the work he was doing at the time, which was the continuation of the philological work that was his first love, really. So growing up with him, apart from this sense of awe of anything so clever going on in our house, and tremendous pride when he would get ready for his expeditions to the deserts of Jordan and fill the driveway with Land Rovers and camping gear and excavation gear and things that would make the neighbours wish they lived somewhere else. Those are the main impressions, really. Things, to be honest, got a bit difficult in the later years. Well, I was a teenager, as things usually do when you're a teenager anyway. But he'd published The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross by then, and was getting a great deal of criticism, which made everything rather strained and difficult in the house. But after that, I went off to university, and as I say, it was really quite several years later when I came back to following up his work more closely and getting to know him a bit better. So it's been a mixed experience.
And can you talk a bit more about the press and the things going on when The Sacred Mushroom was published?
Well, the phone was always ringing, and my mother would try to field the conversation and tell everybody he wasn't available whenever possible. John welcomed any intelligent comments, Anybody who really showed an interest, he would have them over to the house and talk to them for hours, take them around the local sites, talking all the way, deliver them back thoroughly bemused. But anybody who seemed to be following his way of thought, he would make the most of. So many of the comments, in fact, virtually all of them, were published without consulting him, were completely condemnatory, and they came from people who hadn't bothered to read his work or try and understand his position at all, and he got extremely frustrated over that. So as I say, things were a bit difficult at that time.
And certainly, you know, you and I showed, and, you know, my last book, The Holy Mushroom, wouldn't have been possible without your direct and regular involvement in it, and I thank you for that. And in there we clearly showed that many of the attacks that have been even within the entheogen community accepted as common fact about John were in fact fabricated and held no bearing whatsoever. Even the attacks against him, especially by R. Gordon Wasson. And so anyway, I just wanted to mention that and say thank you for all of your help and your contributions in helping this other side of the story that wasn't told for the last 40 years finally get out to the public.
Oh, well, thank you for asking me. It was an honor to work with you. And really, you uncovered things I had no idea were going on, and aspects of the story that I didn't know existed. So I was pleased to be able to help in any way.
All right. So, well, you talked a little bit about who was John Marco Allegro, and so why was he so controversial? Beginning, why don't you start off with the Dead Sea Scrolls and then work into his later work?
Right. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls was where he made his name. He was one of the first editors, and as you said, he was certainly the most controversial of the set. Why he was controversial was because he was always asking uncomfortable questions, which brought him into conflict with the religious and academic establishment of the day. These questions mostly came out of his study of the Dead Sea Scrolls and their significance for the development of Christianity, a topic that not many other of the editors were all that keen to go into, for fairly obvious reasons, since they were mostly Catholic or Lutheran priests. Anyway, the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, it's important to have a basic background on what they were so that you can appreciate how they were significant, I think. They're a collection of biblical and sectarian texts. They're written down around the time Jesus is supposed to have lived and in much the same area. They were found hidden in caves in cliffs to the west of the Dead Sea. Some of them intact in earthenware jars, some in pieces among the dust and backdroppings on the cave floor. Now, most, but not all scholars associate them with the ruins of a monastery nearby, Qumran, and from references within the scroll texts and from contemporary writings by people like Josephus, the historian, they think Qumran may have been headquarters of an extremist Jewish sect called the Essenes. The scrolls cast light on the beliefs and practices of this sect, and in those beliefs and practices, according to John in particular, we see many of the themes, ideas, and even the phraseology of another emerging Jewish sect known as Christianity. When the questions started, well, John Allegro had always been an independent thinker from the time of leaving school, I imagine. The questions really started back in World War II when he was doing service in the Royal Navy. And like all other intelligent young people then and now, he was asking things like why all the killing, what sort of human or divine morality condones or justifies such atrocities on either side, what can a decent person do about it? He thought at the time the church would give him the answer. So as soon as he was able to leave the Navy, which was 1946, he began training for the Methodist ministry. that didn't last very long. At training college, he learnt Greek and Hebrew in order to study the Bible in the original languages. But he soon realised that translations that were usually accepted were by no means definitive. Hebrew in particular, it allows for all sorts of interpretations depending on the context. So for John, the Bible turned from a block of authority on moral questions to a mass of question marks itself. This made it impossible for him to think of becoming a preacher on something he wasn't sure of. That would be hypocrisy. So he gave up training for a career in the church after about 2 months, I think, and transferred to the University of Manchester, which was just across the parkway, to study languages full-time. He enrolled on the Oriental Studies degree course, and he got a first, and he really took to it, particularly Hebrew and Arabic. After Manchester, he started a doctorate at Oxford University in Biblical Hebrew dialects, but that didn't last very long either, because meanwhile the Dead Sea Scrolls had been discovered. This was about 1947-48, and the scholars over in Jerusalem who were looking after them found that fragments of scrolls were coming in such quantities they couldn't cope with the mass. They needed extra help sorting them out. Anyway, to cut it short, John hadn't been long at Oxford before he was invited to go and join the new Dead Sea Scrolls editing team in Jerusalem.
So, well, you mentioned that he was studying for the Methodist ministry, and a common rumor out there is that John was Jewish, and that is actually part of the reason why he made this attack against Christianity. Is that at all true?
He wasn't Jewish at all. No, he was brought up in sort of conventional Methodist church-going background. Now and then, I think he was more interested in church as a social place to meet other girls and have local dances and things like that.
Yeah.
That was while he was a youngster. But there's no Jewish influence at all.
And he was actually French and English, wasn't he?
Well, as far as my aunt, his sister, managed to trace it back, which wasn't very far, I think the name came from either French or Italian, and it was something to do with his maternal grandmother, paternal grandmother, having gone out to France to be a governess, and she had an affair with somebody called, or possibly called Allegro. They weren't even sure that was his real name. Came back with an illegitimate son, who was John Marco Sr., my father's own father. The grandmother died on the way back to England, and John Marco Sr. was brought up as an orphan in England, and eventually he became an officer in the First World War, and when he came back he set up a printing press in Carshalton, which is part of South London, got married, and John and his sisters were the result of that. So that's really as much as we know about family background on that side, I'm afraid. It's all got sort of lost when there was this whiff of illegitimacy and nobody could trace his real ancestry beyond that.
What was going on in Jerusalem, and what was it like there for John?
Well, to start with, he loved it. It was brilliant. In October 53, he went out and joined a very small team. These people were Roland Defoe, Joseph Willig, and Frank Cross, all eminent in their own way. And they were working with Jordan's Director of Antiquities, G.L. Harding. So these four plus John made up the small team who began editing the scrolls. The letters he wrote home show what friendship and mutual respect existed among the team. They're all very blokey, full of jokes and badinage and so on, but he was having a great time. It was something he could do and make a contribution to, and he seemed to be well appreciated. Anyway, as more and more scroll material came in, even they couldn't cope. The team was expanded to 8, but at the first stage they all got on very well. They were working terrifically hard with tremendous dedication and excitement. What they were doing was sorting thousands and thousands of parchment scraps, ranging from fingernail size to strips several inches long. and they could contain anything from a single letter to a whole chapter of say, Isaiah. It was the most intricate and delicate set of jigsaws you could imagine. They were sorting all the pieces by shape, handwriting, content, colour, type of parchments, and so on. It's a wonder they had any eyesight left at all. But as far as the work went, it was fine for the first several months.
When did the derision begin? The harmony didn't last there, as you talk about in your book. What went wrong with the team?
Well, there were certain inherent differences between John and the others. The first one, obviously, was religion. The team was nominally international, but apart from John, who was agnostic by then, everyone was Christian, and several of them were Roman Catholic priests. There were no Jews, no Muslims, no other religion at all. They were all very learned and very well-meaning, but when it came to interpreting their translations, they were bound to share a certain rigid perspective, except John. The others also represented Christian vested interests. For example, Defoe and Milik were part of the Vatican-sponsored École Biblique in Jerusalem. Cross came from the Princeton Theological Seminary, and the others felt they were representing congregations who looked to them as pastors for guidance in theology, meaning accepted theology, rather than anything new or groundbreaking. The second main difference was in the attitude to publication. Now, as John understood it from the start, the principle of the whole thing was to make the official archive of the scroll collection available as soon as possible to scholars everywhere so that people could study them in years to come, and translation would be a work in progress. So from, say, 1954 onwards, John was publishing his share of the scroll fragments in a steady stream of articles in the specialist journals as soon as he'd completed each one, the initial translation anyway. And at first the others encouraged him to publish, but he was virtually alone in doing so. And when it came to producing the completed volumes, the official version of Discoveries in the Judean Desert of Jordan, this was the official scroll compilation published by the Oxford University Press, some of the team were still sitting on their contributions 30 years later. It wasn't all just laziness. They wanted it to be as complete, whole and perfect as possible, with all their commentaries and all the possible interpretations listed down the side.
Yeah, wasn't it actually, sorry to interrupt you, wasn't it actually in about 1997 when they published their first books on the scrolls, whereas Allegro was finished with his in 1968. So it was, if you consider from the time the team was put together until then, it was almost 40 years.
Yeah, I think it was 91 when the first breakthrough came, but that wasn't by any great willingness on the team's part. I think
right, that was Dr. Robert Eisenman from here at
that's right. Yeah,
he's out here at Cal State Long Beach, and I've been trying to get him on the show as well.
Yeah, he did an amazing job, and he actually broke through all the barriers and got it all published. And then Herschel
Shanks, I think.
Shanks, yes, Herschel Shanks. He was another one who went ahead and published. And these people did it risking legal action and a great deal of opposition from the scholars and also from some of the Israeli authorities, I believe, too. But for the sake of getting the texts out so that people everywhere could see what they thought of them and carry on working, they did a great pioneering job. But John had been campaigning for it ever since the beginning, but it was a tragedy in a way, another tragedy, that he died in 1988 before seeing that the scroll texts were even made available.
Yeah, and that was he had pretty much dedicated in large part his life to getting the scrolls out to the public, and then they were finally released, 3 years after his death?
Yes, it was such a shame that it hadn't come earlier. But he was constantly nagging at them.
So,
with very little effect.
John did a series of radio interviews. Why were they such an issue?
Right. Well, another main difference with the team was their attitude to publicity as well as publication. The thing is, especially to begin with, the team needed money to pursue all this research. They later got it through sponsorship from Rockefeller Foundation and others, but in the early days they were desperately worried to know how they could keep buying in the scraps of scroll the Bedouin kept finding and how to keep the team working together on them. So they needed to raise funds for research. John thought he was the man to do it, since he was, after all, very good at talking to people and rousing interest about the scrolls through his books, articles, lectures, radio and TV appearances. The others thought he was much too good at rousing interest and asking these awkward questions that they hadn't yet worked out the answers to. At worst, he was doing it in public. The differences came to a head in January 1956 with those 3 talks. They were on BBC Radio home service for the northern area. They were only intended to have very limited coverage, but they were taken up in the national press and the international press, and they became a real issue. Why they became such an issue was because in the talks he drew parallels between the sect, the Essenes, with their leader, who was called the Teacher of Righteousness, as described in the scrolls, and the story of Jesus. Now, the parallels stand out a mile to anybody who can take an objective look at them. They include things like the whole outlook and way of life of the Essene community, and the language and the phraseology they used about it, and the references, as John interpreted them anyway, to the suffering and probable crucifixion of their leader. John thought the similarities obvious, plain as day, inescapable. However, what they meant was the theologians were going to have to ask again where the story of Jesus Christ came from. The question was it not so much a unique divine revelation beginning on Christmas Day in year 1 as a retelling of old traditions grounded in the history and outlook of first century Jews? Well, nowadays, nothing seems remarkable about that question. The dichotomy seems incredible. Well, at least it does in Britain. I don't know about your side. Religion is part of people's culture, so how could it not be grounded in earlier culture? But you have to understand what is usually overlooked. In the 1950s, people seemed less accustomed to thinking like that. They were more used to accepting what priests or politicians told them about their state religion, and they were shocked by any departure from received wisdom. Wisdom included venerating Jesus Christ as unique, divine, and also historical Son of God.
Well, I was just going to add that here in the U.S., you have the religious right, and they still follow whatever their preachers and the politicians say, and and they make up the largest portion of the American population, unfortunately.
Yeah, it seems incredible to me, but still, it's what you work with. I hope the other proportion managed to get their voice heard eventually. Anyway, why John's ideas meant trouble in the 1950s, even or especially in Britain, was that anything religious held an inflamed significance, being bound up with establishment, authority, status quo, etc. And as they were priests or professors, the colleagues were all part of the establishment.
Right.
I don't know if you feel that there now.
Well, I definitely see that here, but at the same time, there are definitely a number of breakaway professors and things that, I can think of one great instance, Professor Carl Ruck, who's definitely been criticized, and recently Hellman, who I've had on my show, and he was even told that he will never get a job teaching classics in the United States because he published a book about the ancient Greek use of drugs.
I guess they're going through what Allegro went through in the 1950s in Britain. And all I can say is keep going, because there will be people who do listen to them.
Well, what's interesting, though, is back then there were maybe 10 or 20 books on the entire field, and now there are probably, just in English alone, there are probably 400 or 500 books. So it shows that the field is definitely expanded, and it's gaining a lot of ground, but it's still definitely not the commonly accepted stream of thought or the orthodoxy within the mainstream academia.
Yes, they're getting through. It's just getting people to accept the principle of free thinking and freedom of expression, I think. I think you can only do it bit by bit.
Yeah, and the most common problem that even I have was the exact same issue as Allegro and so many other scholars that I know. People attack their work without even reading it and without even seeing what evidence is presented and things like that. And it's always the same circular argument. They want to hold on to their beliefs. They don't want to go to the library and research. They don't want to look through the footnotes. They don't want to even read the author's books. Have you experienced any of that with your book, John Marco Allegro, The Maverick of the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Oh, well, no, mine's hardly been noticed at all, but it's definitely what my father went through. I mean, at the time, they wrote him off as sort of brash and irresponsible, and I'd say he was certainly bold, putting out ideas that his colleagues hadn't agreed on. But, that's what thinking people do. They have original ideas. That's what they're there for. In fact, John wasn't even the first scholar to notice the links between the scrolls and the Gospels, but he was the first to talk about it on radio. So when this happened back in 1956, Devoe and all the rest wrote to the Times newspaper in panic, denying John's interpretation of the scrolls, and they also wrote to his university seeking to discredit him. And everything turned to poison for John in Jerusalem, almost overnight. And all this came in the middle of a tremendous project in which he was playing a key part, which was to open, read and translate the Copper Scroll.
So what was the Copper Scroll, and why did it cause problems for John? Explain to the audience what the Copper Scroll was to begin with.
All right. Well, most of the scrolls were made of leather or parchments, and they were bundled together in jars and, as I said, scattered around as caves. But in one of the caves near Qumran, Cave 3, there were found 2 rolls of metal. They were too badly oxidized to unwrap, but they evidently bore some sort of text because they were sort of roughened on the outside in what appeared to be Hebrew lettering that had been sort of banged out from the inside. Well, they were brought back to the museum, and scientists in Jerusalem and also in the States completely failed to find a way to open the rolls. So John arranged, with everyone's agreement, for the College of Technology in Manchester to have a go. Professor Wright Baker cut them open incredibly delicately, given the sort of equipment they had at the time. And John was there and made the first attempt, the first in about 2,000 years, to read and translate the writing on them. Now, what he found was some discovery. Hundreds of talents of gold, bars of gold, silver vessels in hiding places that mostly seemed to be connected with Qumran. What he found was no less than a list of buried treasure. Imagine the excitement and the need for secrecy, and all the letters that crackled between Manchester and Jerusalem. But then, in the midst of all this excitement, came these 3 radio talks and the denouncement of John Allegro. His colleagues denied his reading of the leather fragments, and they denied his reading of the Copper Scroll. They insisted it was fiction, part of some traditional Arab fable. It was ridiculous, really. But,
yeah, especially since it was written on copper, of all things. I mean, they could have just used a regular piece of parchment, but why would they, unless they were trying to preserve the document, why would they even write it on copper?
Well, definitely, it was something to be kept, and the way it was written, it was just a plain list, it wasn't dressed up with any sort of fictitious character or anything like that. But no, they weren't having it. And not only that, they forbade John to say anything about it. So frustration all round. And John complied.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, he did what they said as far as he could. He accepted, he always had, that Millet was the one who would be doing the official translation, and that this official one should come out before his version. He made his own version while he was opening it, evidently, but he kept it back year after year while his publishers all but lost patience. He nearly lost the book deal. He was waiting for Millet, and Millet eventually issued a French translation in a journal in August 58. He also was under pressure to bring out the translation, but he found, like John, even more so, that it was extremely difficult. But the official volume was due in early 1960, and John's book was then scheduled for autumn of the same year. But in the event, there was some hold-up in printing the official version, and John's book, The Treasure of the Copper Scroll, did appear a few weeks before the official one. Not that he meant it to, but he was promptly accused of pirating the translation rights. It was a flagrantly absurd accusation. Yeah. And so was
the what?
I would say so was the denial of his translation. It seemed so obvious to everybody else. But anyway, it served to poison his name among his colleagues and many of their successors for, well, ever after, really.
Yeah, and that really seems to be the common theme wherever you look into this stuff, whether it's the Copper Scroll, and his original intent was to publish the scrolls for peer reviews so that everybody could have access to them, while the others held on to them until the 1990s. So, but let's go from there. Let's talk about for a second. Let's segue into later academics who went back and reanalyzed the Copper Scroll. Didn't several scholars eventually come out in agreement with John on that?
Yes, more or less they did anyway. I think Judith Lefkowitz has published a very definitive study. Philip Davies also supports his arguments. And several others have agreed that it was much more likely to be this list of treasure, as John thought, for the reasons we've mentioned, as well as the translation of it. So he has been vindicated, I would say. Not everybody agrees, but the majority.
Well, so, he's just about to, and we'll go into this more in a moment, but he's just about to receive some more vindication. Could the conflict of ideas have gone further than the vendetta against John? Was there really something in the scrolls that they wanted to suppress?
Well, I'm aware this question's been rumbling on ever since, really, and from time to time it came up while John was working at it. Was there a Catholic monopoly intent on suppressing scroll publication because the scrolls cast doubt on the gospel version of events? Now, from time to time, John thought there must be. He suffered such almost persecution at times. Because of the times his films were withheld, or publication of scroll text was delayed again and again, or in some cases when his access to the scrolls was blocked and they refused him permission to go back to the museum on various occasions. But in the end, and on the whole, he decided there was nothing sinister going on. He did, after all, know the team personally, and he said they'd neither the malice nor the wit to mount a conspiracy. And he eventually decided the delay in publication was just basically due to mismanagement and probably a good measure of academic jealousy. But he did refuse to believe that there was anything much more surreptitious going on, really, though I know that it's still questionable to some people.
Talk about Michael Badgett and Richard Lay's conclusions in the Dead Sea Scrolls deception.
Well, they thought it was definitely some sort of conspiracy going on, and I just don't know. They've been through the letters that I've been through as well, and I know that things were very hot at the time. John got very angry at times, with good cause. I don't know what else was going on behind the scenes, really, and I can only say what John himself perhaps reluctantly concluded, some 10 years after the event, that they just bungled the whole affair, really. It wasn't very well planned, and there weren't enough resources to start with, and he was never very sure who had control of the resources. He would have liked to sort of circumvent the whole editing team and the museum team and everything, and sort of set up a separate foundation, completely independent, which he would have, he wanted to include Muslim scholars, Jewish scholars, Christian scholars, non-denominational people, atheists, everybody, just to take an objective look at the scrolls and recognise that they were important to 3 religions of the area, as well as to the countries involved. But nothing came of it, and given the political climate of the time, I don't think anything was likely to, even if there'd been money available to set up the foundation he would have liked.
And that is really still the case, except for maybe Davies, is that almost all of the scrolls scholars today is still give a very heavy modern-day Christian slant to their decipherment.
They tend to. I think the Jewish scholars also want to give a fairly heavy Jewish slant to the decipherment as well.
Right.
Have them upholding, the traditions on which they've based their nationhood, really. So there are vested interests on all sides, which doesn't make it easy to take any objective view of the scrolls.
All right. So to be clear, explain again the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls for Christianity.
Well, right, it's worth summing up, really. The scrolls describe the life and thoughts of an extremist Jewish sect living under Roman occupation around or just before the alleged time of Jesus. The beliefs and practices of this sect correspond in many ways to New Testament beliefs and practices, and even phraseology. John thought the sect must be the Essenes described by the contemporary historian Josephus, and he believed in many essentials Christianity was born out of the Essenism described in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The main question you have to go on to is how this happened. Now, the similarities between the two sects were indisputable, especially in John's view, but there were major differences, which he was first to acknowledge. For a start, the Essenes of Qumran were an enclosed sect. They were very inward-looking, although Josephus said they also had members as sort of sub-branch scattered among local communities. The early Christians, by contrast, went out evangelizing and recruiting people from all backgrounds and all levels in society. And the Essenes had a teacher who was called Son of God in the same sense as all other men of faith were sons of God. But the Christians had a teacher who they said was literally a son of God, and the Christian one was sort of half supernatural, a first century superhero. So Christian scholars emphasized the differences, and they downplayed the links between the scrolls and the Gospels, but John thought the similarities were far more important than the differences. He saw the New Testament as a reworking of Essenism, made to appeal to Gentiles in the outer world. But then he asked, why was it reworked? What had happened to the Essenes? They seemed to disappear when the Christians came to prominence. Were they all persecuted to death? Did they flee? Or did they go underground, as it were? If they did, what had they to hide? And that came onto his next major theories, the one that caused even bigger rumpus. Sacred mushroom of the cross.
Right. So in May 1970, John published The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. Mm-hmm. How did the questions he was asking about the Dead Sea Scrolls lead to an interest in mushrooms?
Well, it is indirectly. It was through his work analysing biblical words and phrases. And that was his job as a philologist. It seems fairly natural in the sense of technique. Didn't seem very natural in terms of what he came up with. The thing is, there are no explicit references in conventional translations of the Bible or the Dead Sea Scrolls to things like mind-expanding entheogens or hallucinatory mushrooms. But however, as John had realised at an early stage, these conventional translations aren't as definitive as they usually accepted to be. He looked for possible alternatives to some of the puzzling bits in the Bible. He started with the New Testament names and nicknames, looking into their etymology and asking whether or how they might relate to Essenism or to any other theme for that matter. Well, bearing in mind about the Essenes, they were healers and herbalists as well as holy men. They had a big repository of secret knowledge, according to Josephus. So John was asking, what was this? He also asked where they got their secret knowledge, and he looked for the answer in the special words and phrases they used, words which survive in the scrolls in the Bible. He uncovered some surprising possibilities. Nothing in the Gospels or Acts, he said at one point in the talk, is what it seems. Anyway, that's where the research started that led to the theories behind the sacred mushroom and the cross.
And as I showed in my book, The Holy Mushroom, John had been accused for decades, literally, for basically taking Gordon Wasson's ideas and running with them. But when we got in and studied the notes, what we realized was actually a very dismissive attitude towards Wasson's ideas, and really John had focused his attention on Professor John Ramsbottom's work from London Botanical Museum, as well as he'd cited Robert Graves quite a bit. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, he certainly wasn't the first. He did use Ramsbottom's work very specifically. As you know, he took passages from it, really, and relied on it for much of the technical detail about the mushrooms and the acknowledgement of how they were used. He certainly acknowledged Wasson's work. I think the dismissive part came in, to be honest, a bit later. They dismissed each other's work. He gathered from Wasson's comments that he wasn't prepared to follow John in applying much the same body of knowledge to Christianity, and nor did he seem very willing to go to look at the detail of John's work before sort of dismissing it in public in some rather scurrilous attacks. And John didn't want to play with that, so I think as he didn't bother following it up very much with Wasson himself. He laid himself open to criticism for not corresponding more with Wasson and sorting things out with him. It might have helped, it might not. I think by that time John was only looking for criticism because he's had nothing else. And he was really hoping that some scholars would take the trouble to look into the notes and the reasoning that lay behind the sacred mushroom and deal with him on a sort of academic grounds instead of rather emotional or religious grounds, which sort of cast the theme of most of the criticism that came after it.
So even Wasson had attacked Allegro's work without really reading it and studying it himself, which he later admitted to Jack Hare and Professor Carl Ruck and a couple of other people that he had actually relied on a Jewish rabbi and a Catholic Monsignor for their impressions of John's book rather than studying it himself. And another thing that I find ironic about Wasson's attack on John is that in Mushrooms, Russia, and History, he actually dedicated 31 pages to the sexual symbolism relating to the mushrooms and various cultures and religions, including Arab, but denied John's own similar discoveries with Judeo-Christian themes.
Right, well, I think this was fairly typical, actually, and much the same applied to Robert Graves, that they were happy and extremely interested to discuss it at a distance with religions that they weren't particularly involved with. But when it came to Christianity or Judaism for that matter, it was all very much inflamed. It brought in part of the establishment. They were afraid of rocking the boat and getting a whole lot of bad publicity for completely wrong unacademic reasons. So I think John's originality, and, well, not so much originality as boldness, was in applying these fertility themes and the knowledge of the use of mushrooms and similar entheogenic drugs in religion, applying them to Christianity. That's what really alarmed people and stirred up all the fuss which of course he knew it would, but he wasn't expecting quite such an emotional reaction from the academic community as well as the general public.
So what was the sacred mushroom and the cross all about?
Yeah, I think need to get this straight from the beginning, really. It's about the development of religion from the time around 6,000 years ago, when religious ideas were first put down in writing. It shows how the first conceptions about the essence of divinity were based on its most fundamental purpose, which was to bestow fertility on the earth, that is, to bring life, beginning of everything. The book also shows the power and persistence of this idea over the ages, and also the cultic practices that kept it going from generation to generation, nation to nation, across continents. It all started 6,000 years ago, but in John's view, it had continued and was still evident right up to biblical times, if not beyond. Anyway, central to these fertility cults was the use of entheogens, which are, psychoactive substances derived from plants. They used to reach a higher state of consciousness, a sort of sense of community with gods. One of the chief sources was the sacred mushroom, Amnita muscari or fly agaric, which was at once the symbol and the embodiment of fertility, and the means to understand it. Now, priests and shamans throughout history had used mushroom drugs in their rites. This is all very well attested, from Finland to Mexico to India, classical Greece, to name but a few. There were many references to mushrooms and their use in the Sumerian tablets that John was starting with as evidence of these first beginnings of the cult. And he looked at these, and he looked at these later manifestations in some of the places I mentioned, and he asked, why should it be any different in the Middle East? Well, people were shocked at this. The warlike and, I must say, extremely bloodthirsty desert god of the Old Testament, Yahweh, seems on the face of it to have nothing at all to do with the fertility cult based on the use of the sacred mushroom, and still less as the all-seeing, all-knowing, all-forgiving Christian God. So clearly, it's well known, God changes face to suit the changing needs of the times. But John believed the essence of this original divine principle, God as the father of fertility, was still there. And moreover, so was the cult that kept the God alive, and the evidence for this continuity was in the language of religion.
Let me ask you something, Judy. And then I'll let you finish from there. But was John really the first to come up with this idea that Christianity was based on fertility cults? I mean, he seems to be the one who received all of the attacks for the idea, but was he really the one who generated the idea?
I'm sure he wasn't entirely, but I think there were people in previous centuries even.
Yeah, well, and I guess I'm just sort of asking a rhetorical question there because, in my own research, I discovered nearly 200 publications between the 1770s to present, just on that one topic, and several of them focusing specifically on Judeo-Christianity. And, Erotica Judaica is one of the most obvious, but, Thomas Inman and a number of...
Oh, yes, indeed.
A number of other of these guys, they went, in the 1800s, they went into depth on their belief that Christianity was founded on a fertility cult, and then even in the early 1900s, I don't remember the scholar's name, but he had written several papers proposing a whole new methodology for studying religion based on sex and fertility cults.
Yeah, indeed they did, but no one's heard of them anymore, and for better or worse, is the publicity that John received in the middle of the 20th century that got people going on it. To be honest, I'm not sure which of all those texts he was familiar with. I'm sure he'd come across some of them, and they probably gave him the idea of taking it further. I think he was probably the first to systematically try and prove all this through linguistic evidence, because not all that long before they'd discovered a great number of tablets and inscriptions in Sumerian from this area of Mesopotamia where it was believed at the time to be the cradle of civilization, or one of them, and where writing first started to develop, first in pictograms, then cuneiform, and then gradually evolving, as it were, into more familiar scripts. So it was the amount of work that had by then been amassed about Sumerian that enabled John to relate the languages of the Bible and their predecessor languages, or as well the Sanskrit, the Phoenician, Akkadian and so on, right back to Sumerian, the first of all, and to discover the themes that persisted throughout these thousands of years and throughout these different languages and cultures. So although the germs of the ideas had been around, as you say, for centuries, I think a combination of this linguistic approach plus the publicity available and afforded to people saying remarkable things about religion in the mid-20th century was what meant that he got all the flack for it.
Well, not to mention that he added the mushroom in there, but
Yes.
It's like John Rush's work, and he's got a new book coming out in probably around March of next year, and he's going to have more than 200 images in the book showing many instances how the mushrooms were hidden, and certainly Professor Carl Ruck and Mark Hoffman and their team of researchers has certainly published a lot in that same regard, as has Giorgio Samarini and myself, along with Andrew Utaji in our first book, but even more so in my last book. Eventually they're going to have to answer to why all of these mushrooms are in this Christian artwork. And the more they go through the libraries of the world, like Google Books and Amazon Books and these things, the more they do this and the more they digitize and archive all of these ancient texts and put them online, the more questions are going to be raised, and the more they're going to have to look at this. And it's just there's overwhelming evidence today that wasn't there when John wrote The Sacred Mushroom of the Cross, or published it in 1970.
No, I think you're right. In the 70s, it was quite difficult for probably people in academic, inverted commas, respectable world to take it very seriously, because mushrooms was something they associated with either rather fancy dinner parties or drug cults and hippies and sort of the groups of young people loading around that they rather looked down on in establishment terms in those days.
And still do for the most.
Yes. But one thing, John, I don't think he was really fully aware of all the artistic work that gives the strong evidence for the use of mushrooms throughout medieval and Renaissance period. I think if he had been, he would have found the way a lot easier, because I think if people had been able to see artistically the many representations of mushrooms, they would have accepted it much more easily than by coming to a rather dry and very difficult to read literary text, treating mainly on ancient languages that hardly anybody knew anything about. He didn't make it easy for himself that way, and he could have done a lot better in future years. If, as I say, if he'd been made aware of the art evidence for mushroom cult.
Yeah, especially if he had, obviously he used the plain coral fresco, but if he had, dozens of images to put throughout the book, like we have today, he certainly would have had a much stronger argument. And and even the texts, the epistle to the renegade bishops that I published in the in the Holy Mushroom was actually published by Harvard University in the early 90s and went completely unnoticed.
Yeah, I wonder if it was deliberately unnoticed, because all that sort of material, it would have just made it more easy for people to accept the rather startling revelations that John came out with. They'd have been more attuned in their mind to such ideas.
So what were the strengths of John's approach in the Sacred Mushroom and the Cross?
Well, the main strength, I think, lay in the insights it afforded into the mind and thought of our ancestors. He was using language analysis as a tool to understand what was important to people 6,000 years ago, how they thought the world worked, what spirituality meant to them, what they meant by God. And another strength, which was questioned again at the time, it took philology to a new level. It brought out the evolutionary nature of the Indo-European languages, something that wasn't fully recognized at the time, and it showed the interrelated development of language and philosophy, or religious thought, since the workings of the world were seen in religious terms, and this was the most important thing to the learned men, the priests of the day. The tool, philology, was far from complete, and John really only made a beginning, but he did show the way other linguists might follow. Another of the tragic aspects of all this is that they didn't. At least only in very recent years have people seemed to be prepared to take up his ideas and look more into the contribution of Sumerian and the different sort of word combinations that could have led to our own languages.
And I might point out that a large reason behind scholars failing to be even willing to look into John's work is because there were so many straw man arguments set up against John to literally prevent people from even looking into it. So first, what had to be done was each and every one of these straw man arguments had to be faced and remove this blockade. In one aspect, and then there was that Vladimir Toporov paper from the Russian linguist that Professor Karl Ruck has talked about in his works, that this guy basically laid the groundwork for what should have been a complete re-examination of Allegro's theories back in 1985.
Yeah.
And here it's 2009, and this stuff didn't even get mentioned in print until the last year or two.
Yes, I'd like to know why, but now one would hope his chance, really. I think there's a lot more openness, and with the republication of the Sacred Mushroom due quite soon, I hope it'll get things going again. But the other thing that John tried to do to move things on, what he was trying to do was bring some objectivity into the study of Christianity by showing how it developed out of these older religions. And so any claims the Church had to moral or temporal authority were seen to be late additions, not sudden divine inspiration. And the Church didn't like this, of course, but one would hope it would appeal to people outside the Church, to freethinkers and humanists, because morality, if it's no longer accepted as God-given, it should then be based on a clear-sighted humanistic view of relationships, quite untrammeled by religious obligations. This was one of John's main themes, and something he hoped would come out of his book, but it didn't, because of the furore it caused. But
all right.
One hope it's there yet to be discovered.
And you kind of dropped a you let the cat out of the bag there a second. Not that I haven't been talking about it for the last several years that the Sacred Mushroom and the Cross was going to be republished, but
well, we've been working on it for some time, haven't we?
So yes, you and I have been working on getting that finished, and Professor Carl Ruck has agreed to publicly endorse the Sacred Mushroom and the Cross to help further academic study. And so I think that the Sacred Mushroom and the Cross is got a good chance, and obviously some of the theories need to be reanalyzed, and he certainly wasn't 100% correct in his ideas by any means, but I think his overall foundation as a pioneering work is what was important, and just the ideas he laid out and the questions that he proposed that certainly over the last 4 decades, many of them have been proved correct.
Yeah, indeed. I think, to be fair, we must go into the drawbacks and the weaknesses of the theory, because they were really huge. There are difficulties and they haven't been properly overcome, and it's important for people, even if they take up the Sacred Mushroom with an inquiring rather than condemnatory mind, to be aware of the difficulties and keep a balanced perspective. There is one major difference, which is the major difficulty, the inherent unlikeliness of the concealment theory. What John thought was that these cults had been continued right into Essene and Christian times, but that they'd been deliberately disguised in apparently unrelated stories in order to get to sort of slip the secret knowledge past the authorities.
And
this is just so complicated.
Yeah, and not to mention to slip it past the orthodoxy, which or later orthodoxy, I should say, and as John Rush has shown and is showing in his upcoming work, is that he can show the mushroom theme, from 1st or 2nd century all the way to today in brand new modern churches. So that has to be answered to. And
yes, I think there was probably no need for any of the concealment. So I think John was overcomplicating things there, and I'm glad to hear of the new evidence that shows how strongly it was still continued. But the other major problem with this work altogether, not really enough was known of Sumerian, particularly in 1970, to prove many of the word derivations that he rested his argument on. Many scholars even denied there was any link at all between Sumerian and the later Indo-European languages. The evidence was there. It was on inscriptions and tablets, but they were up to 6,000 years old, and there just weren't enough of them. This may be different now. I'm hoping that people have an even wider knowledge of the language of Sumerian and can do a bit more meaningful research on it. What John was doing was assembling Sumerian words, as the Sumerians did, by putting together phonemes, which are like parts of words, word blocks, that were known to exist from the tablets and inscriptions and so on. But in the book, you found he put an asterisk against all the combinations he made that hadn't actually been found in that form. They were just possible. They sounded right, but he wasn't sure of them. And there were just too many asterisks. It just needs a whole lot more work to verify and substantiate his linguistic work, I must say. So I think those are the main problems. I know also that sometimes his botanical knowledge slipped. And he was going very much on existing written sources about mushrooms, and I think the field's a whole lot more complicated than he realized. Right,
and he certainly took the blame for other scholars' errors as well, whereas, for just about everyone who didn't bother to check his endnotes, they directed the attacks against him instead of looking at the people who he was citing and cross-referencing these citations.
Yes, easy to do. It didn't help him.
Sum up the significance of the sacred mushroom and the cross.
Well, to sum up, he realised there was this massive area of common religious experience underlying most, if not all, religions, including Christianity. It had developed out of man's original need to control the fundamentals of life, like sun, rain, fertility in general. And as these needs changed to become social or tribal or military, people needed different things from their gods, so their perception of God changed. But the source and the nature of the God's power was still the same. It was the same life force as in earliest times. And this continuity is there in the language. You can see this, or to take a very basic example, the Sumerian one phoneme, Su, it recurs for God in, it comes into the Greek as Zeus, in Latin as Jove, Hebrew Jehovah, Yahweh. The sounds vary a bit. They mutate from one language to another, but the same root is there. And John was finding this in word after word. He was definitely onto something. He was showing the way, but there were just too many difficulties with theory to convince people across the board. And what happened was the sacred mushroom and the cross met such overwhelming hostility that the whole project was all but swept away, and leaving only a few supporters who've been battling ever since, nearly 40 years, as you say, to restore rationality to the whole thing. Now's its chance.
Yeah, I agree with that. Now is its chance, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it back in print and see what comes about of it this time. Maybe it will cause just as big a flurry this time as it did last time. Who knows? But speaking of that, what was the effect of publishing The Sacred Mushroom in the first time?
Well, to be honest, on the church, it had very little effect. It roused such a storm that everything was swept away. The church was able to sort of ride above it. So, of course, this is rubbish, and that was it. Among humanists, The Sacred Mushroom and also its sequel, The End of the Road, were welcomed. They had this fresh air outlook and secular morality. And in humanist terms, casting off shackles of religious authority and sort of freeing people from feeling obliged to take the Gospels as fact, it ought to enable people to accept true responsibility for themselves. John felt this, and I share it, that we should base morality on relationships with others and with the world. And you have to believe in human values like compassion and respect and tolerance and peace. Clear thinking for yourself in Allegro's terms, that should be the way forward, because that's what he stood for. And it was the message humanists took from his books, at least the ones that were prepared to say anything about it. But they didn't have much of a voice in 1970. And to be honest, I don't know they've got much more of a voice now. It's what people read into the books tends to remain private, I think. Sorry, go on.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, in personal terms, you can't shy away from it. The Sacred Mushroom ruined John's career, and it also ruined his marriage and his family life, because he'd received virtually nothing but rejection, criticism, slander, ridicule. But worst of all, the most undermining thing was the total refusal of the academic world to take him seriously. And even though he tried to brush it off, he always wore an air of bravado, and his wife never failed to stand by him. The reaction left him restless and bitter, and it did take him a long time to pick up the pieces. And by that time, a lot of damage had been done, really, in personal terms.
So, wow. Well, it's quite a story, and I must say that I have a feeling in one way or another John is going to get the last word. And I've heard people rumored, and obviously it's not true, but that was the only book that he ever wrote on his research on the mushrooms. But he had actually written several books, and you had just mentioned another one, which was the follow-up or part two, his book, The End of a Road. And then after that, he wrote actually well, 5 more books, but 4 additional books that furthered his research and that he laid out in The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, and he wrote The Chosen People, Lost Gods, and he also wrote a book that's actually rather famous even today and still in print, called The Dead Sea Scrolls and the Christian Myth. Would you like to talk about that book and maybe go in a little bit into his other books? In fact, if you wouldn't mind, would you just discuss briefly what each of those books were about? The End of the Road, The Chosen People, Lost Gods, etc., and give people just a brief background on what they were about?
Well, The End of the Road was, as you said, a sequel to The Sacred Mushroom, in that it was looking at what John felt the consequences ought to be of doing without religion in your life. It presented the humanist side of morality, the need for people to take responsibility for themselves and not to rest on apparently God-given morality. If they could no longer believe that they were being directed to act in a certain way by God, Jesus, and that crew, they had to think of it for themselves. And this ought reasonably to be a much more, a much sounder way of conducting your life. Not everybody saw it that way, of course, but as I said, among students, humanists, anybody sort of interested in morality on a personal level, that was quite popular, that book, and it's easy to read and only a slim volume, so that did do quite well, I think, for a short time. The Chosen People is the history of the Jewish peoples from Old Testament times onwards. He used a great number of contemporary sources, the Greek, Roman classicists and historians, and in general terms he shows the genesis of the sort of the Jewish nationhood dream, and that was continually tested out and tried out in one expedition after another, a sort of cyclical view of history that you can see recurring throughout the scrolls. It's very readable, and it's worth looking up for an inside view of the whole history of the Jewish nation. It has some points that make people sort of wonder, is this interpretation right, or what's the evidence for that? But it's a fairly fresh air attempt to be objective about it. I think it's worth looking at. The Christian Myth. John was most proud of this book. He felt that it was probably what he called his ultimate book about the scrolls, but it was taking a different angle on his research on the scrolls and also on the theories behind the sacred mushroom. He went back to the scrolls for writing it, and what they reveal of the worldview of the people who wrote them, the Essenes from Qumran. As this new book, it shows how and why Essene concepts evolved into Christianity, and how the early church fathers spun these into a web of temporal and moral authority, the birth and development of the religion as such. John held the strength of this web, Christianity, came not from an accident of history in the birth of Jesus, as we generally accept or are told happened, but from a much older source in age-old myth and prophecy. These Essene links, which, as I said before, they recur loud and clear in the language and imagery of the New Testament, include things like the Council of 12, echoed in the 12 Disciples, the idea of redemptive sacrifice, the communal meal, names derived from titles, and the whole focus on grace and divine light. Now, key to the theology of the scrolls, according to John in this book, is the incarnate Redeemer, who is known as divine knowledge or wisdom personified. It all gets very philosophical. Wisdom is also called the Word and divine light, and it's personified in various forms throughout the scrolls and the Bible, and also in the alternatives to the Bible, the Gnostic Gospels that were discovered about the same time. Some of the personifications appear as the firstborn, the bride of God, the mother of earth. They're all manifestations of the same divine essence. Again, in the New Testament, the Word is personified. It becomes flesh in Jesus, the Redeemer. Jesus is of the light, the divine essence. The terminology recurs. It's like echoes throughout the Bible and throughout these other texts. The puzzling thing is how it was sort of engineered to make sure that we only hear about the four Gospels. We don't hear anything about the Essenes, and we don't hear very much about the Gnostic Gospels that seem to have been squashed out of existence by the activities of the early Church Fathers. As John saw it, the Essenes don't seem to have survived the fall of the Temple, which was in 70 AD, but their principles do survive. They're Gnostic principles, the Gnostics of the early Church. John believed these Gnostics were the direct successors to the Essenes. They shared a similar outlook on the themes I've been talking about, like redemption and grace, divine understanding, divine light, so on. The stories that they tell are set out in the Gnostic Gospels, and these seem in many ways to parallel the four Gospels selected for the New Testament. Again, they share vocabulary, style, theme. They're all largely about heroic redeemers sent from heaven to save the world. Jesus figures he's one of them. He's the superhero in the New Testament, but he's only one of several in the Gnostic Gospels. And the Gnostic redeemer Simon Magus plays the main role in the Gnostic Gospels, but also he appears in a sort of cameo role in the Acts of the Apostles, I believe, in the Bible. And what they all come to are the Word turned into flesh, and they all reflect the working of God on earth. This may seem completely, unusual to say the least. It's a different slant on the Gospel story, the New Testament story,
right.
And it came mainly from studying the Gnostic Gospels, which, even more so than the Dead Sea Scrolls, were really kept back for many, many years, and only fairly recently have been explored to any great depth by other scholars. It does seem that why we all ended up with Roman Christianity rather than Gnostic Essenism was largely a political issue back in the 4th century. The thing is, the Gnostic network, probably like the Essenes, was a secret sect and a potential source of insurrection, so it would be a threat to Roman imperialism. To survive in the politics of that time, the new religion, any new religion, would have to net in all sorts of people and get adopted by Rome, which Christianity did, because it was adopted by the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. And from that time on, Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire, with all the power and pomp and circumstance that it needed to keep it as such. So in this book, John was really looking at the development of the church as an institution from sources that aren't obvious for people who are accustomed only to look to the Bible and the New Testament as the fount of all your philosophy and everything. But again, a bit like the sacred mushroom, I feel that he could have gone a lot further. He could have explored this and verified it in many ways with a whole lot more research.
Right.
I think time was catching up with him by then.
Well, and he, some have said that he had abandoned the theory, which, as I mentioned a minute ago, with printing actually 5 more books on it, he never actually abandoned the idea. But, what did he do? Why didn't he go further into that direction? What was happening?
In the direction of the sacred mushroom, you mean?
Right. Go ahead, sorry.
Okay. Well, he hadn't abandoned it, but he sort of shifted emphasis in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Christian myth. He still maintained that Christianity like many or most other religions, had grown out of this ancient fertility cults based on mushroom worship, and that many biblical terms, including the name of Jesus, probably derived from mushroom terms. And he thought that some of the Gnostic cults were probably keeping the old practices alive, for example, things like anointing with semen, and also that Christians, like pagans, very probably used mushrooms to attain divine knowledge. If he'd, as we said before, if he'd known all the artwork that's evidence of how all this continued, I think he'd have made an even stronger point of that. But he wasn't saying they worshipped mushrooms directly at that point in the way that people of much earlier cultures seem to do. It's the fertility aspects are sort of subsumed into this doctrine of light rather than mushroom worship directly, which seems to be central to the Christian myth. This is something that the Old Testament, the New Testament, scrolls, the Gnostic texts, they're all shot through with it. Lights, fire, themes like morning star, pyramids of fire, that sort of thing. The whole theme of the quest for eternal light. It's more important than the various characters with the various adventures in the stories, like Jesus or Simon and the rest. They all reflect the theme, but they don't give rise to it. The emphasis is away from the human, more onto the philosophical here, I think. It seems very likely that the whole doctrine of light that he perceived through analysing the poetry of the scrolls as well as that in the Bible, it seems to have come originally from Egyptian sun worship, and that in itself would have evolved from the ancient fertility religions. I say it was a new direction, though going off at a tangent in a way from the original idea of the primacy of fertility. He did go back to the sacred mushroom, especially in his last years. In fact, he was going back extremely strongly. It was always his first love, philology. And he had two main themes that he was pursuing in the years between the publication of the Christian myth and the time he died. He was looking at the analysis of biblical words and phrases to find more evidence of mushroom cults. He was finding quite a lot, but he hadn't published it yet. And he was also gaining insight through language into the Sumerian culture, the whole philosophy and outlook of these earliest ancestors. The thing is, to bringing back themes that he'd worked on right from the start of his career, he was finding that Sumerian myths parallel Judaic myths and Old Testament traditions in many respects, and they're separated only by translation and mistranslation, first into Hebrew, then into Greek. So it was these ancient origins which he was exploring when he died, and unfortunately, he didn't have time to publish the work he was engaged on.
Yeah,
so quickly.
And he died on his 65th.
65th birthday, 17th of February, 1988.
And well, let's talk for a second about his last book that he published just before his death, which was Physician, Heal Thyself. And that book is still in print and available as well, I believe.
Yes, I believe it is, yeah. Well, again, he went back to the Essenes, who were known to be healers as well as herbalists, and he explored their attitude to healing, the whole attitude to where they lived and the source of healing, very closely associated with where they lived by the Dead Sea, which was held to be the deepest point in Earth, therefore the nearest to the fire or sea of eternal knowledge that they believed was down there. And I think that went back to their the stories of the fallen angels, right back in the beginning of the Old Testament, were felt to have fallen to earth at that point and established there as a sort of underground repository of the divine knowledge they brought with them. And the Essenes felt that they could tap into this through where they lived, through their natural associations with the Dead Sea. The book goes on to look at the different aspects of healing, and not in a very practical, up-to-date sense of healers, though it sort of relates personal healing to philosophical points.
Judy, what would you say was John Allegro's legacy?
Well, the tangible parts of it were his books and also his many articles and the thousands of photos he took that are available for people to study the scrolls further with. And then, as one of the original translators and editors, he was helping to lay foundations for future study of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But beyond that, the obvious bits, it was his imaginative interpretations that really got people going about it. He brought the past to life. He could do it in a way that engaged people of all backgrounds and got them all asking questions about religion, where it came from, what it meant to them, how it mattered. These were the questions that were important to him, to himself. The sacred mushroom, the cross, raised a whole lot more questions about the origin and practice of religions, and it also pointed the way to further research in language and also ethnobotany. As we said, I hope people will take it on from there. It's by far a close question. The Dead Sea Scrolls and the Christian myth explored how the Christian story developed out of Essene and Gnostic philosophy, and the doctrine of lights came out of ancient sun worship and fertility religion. And again, I feel that needs further inquiry by anybody interested enough to take it further. Really, John's whole career was of asking questions about religion, language, freedom of speech, and evidence. Basically, the right to think for oneself. That was what he valued more than anything, and I think that must remain his main legacy.
What single idea would you like people to take away from this interview?
I think they should read his books in the spirit of inquiry in which he wrote them, thinking that the freedom to inquire, to think, to speak your mind, to write about ideas is one of the most valuable things we all have, and it's worth perpetuating.
And we've been speaking with Judith Ann Brown. And Judy, thank you so much, and it's been a wonderful interview with you. Would you like to let everybody know again the name of your book and any information you would like to provide?
Oh, my book is called John Marco Allegro, The Maverick of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's published by William B. Edmonds, and I think you can still get it. Not many people have, I must say, but it tries to put the record straight about John and talk about his life and his work and how the main themes of his research and the campaigns he was always working for to open up the scrolls to further inquiry and to maintain or encourage freedom of speech, freedom of thought. And that was his main theme.
Well, everybody should get out there and buy Judy's book, John Marco Allegro, The Maverick of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I've read it a couple of times. I've got a copy of it here on my shelf. I actually had 2 copies at one point and gave one away, but I thought it was an excellent read, and I highly recommend it to anybody who is interested in this entire field of study. And I think you've made a very valuable contribution to the entire field, because there were so many rumors flying around about your father for so many decades, and it was really good to see you put that out there and just put an end to that for anybody who is intelligent enough to pick up the book and read it for themselves and see the evidence for themselves. And not only that, but his books as well, including yours, It's been quite a pleasure working with you for the last 5 years on these various projects, and I'm very excited that I've had the chance to work with you on getting The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross back in print.
Oh, thanks. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me. Anyway, the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, it's important to have a basic background on what they were so that you can appreciate how they were significant, I think. They're a collection of biblical and sectarian texts. They're written down around the time Jesus is supposed to have lived and in much the same area. They were found hidden in caves in cliffs to the west of the Dead Sea. Some of them intact in earthenware jars, some in pieces among the dust and backdroppings on the cave floor. Now most, but not all scholars, associate them with the ruins of a monastery nearby, Qumran, and from references within the scroll texts and from contemporary writings by people like Josephus, the historian, they think Qumran may have been headquarters of an extremist Jewish sect called the Essenes. The scrolls cast light on the beliefs and practices of this sect, and in those beliefs and practices, according to John in particular, we see many of the themes, ideas, and even the phraseology of another emerging Jewish sect known as Christianity. When the questions started, well, John Allegro had always been an independent thinker from the time of leaving school, I imagine. The questions really started back in World War II when he was doing service in the Royal Navy. And like all other intelligent young people then and now, he was asking things like why all the killing, what sort of human or divine morality condones or justifies such atrocities on either side, what can a decent person do about it? He thought at the time the church would give him the answer. So as soon as he was able to leave the Navy, which was 1946, he began training for the Methodist ministry. That didn't last very long. At training college, he learnt Greek and Hebrew in order to study the Bible in the original languages. But he soon realized that translations that were usually accepted were by no means definitive. Hebrew in particular, it allows for all sorts of interpretations depending on the context. So for John, the Bible turned from a block of authority on moral questions to a mass of question marks itself. This made it impossible for him to think of becoming a preacher on something he wasn't sure of. That would be hypocrisy. So he gave up training for a career in the church after about 2 months, I think, and transferred to the University of Manchester, which was just across the parkway, to study languages full-time.
How are you this morning?
I'm fine, thanks. It's nice to be here.
And I really appreciate you coming on, and I've been telling the listeners for, probably about 9 months now that you're going to be on any day or any week. So it's great to finally have you on the show, and very much appreciated. Would you like to start off by telling the audience a little bit about yourself, who you are, your educational background, and that sort of thing?
Well, I'm John Allegro's daughter, and my main work is writing and editing as part of Plain Language Commission. In recent years, since his death, I've been looking more into my father's work, leading up to the publication of his biography in 2005, where I was very glad to be able to use the letters and photos and other materials from that he'd prepared at the time that my mother lent to me. And the purpose of all that was to really put the record straight about my father, who's had a lot of bad press over the years, rightly or wrongly. So I hope that in my book I was able to put his side of things and say what it was really like at the time, because with hindsight all sorts of criticisms and skewed assessments can work their way in, and I think it's important to go back to the original documents and other records to see what was really happening at the time, which was in John's case from the mid-1950s onwards.
And what was it like growing up with a figure like John Allegro? Especially as your father.
Well, to be honest, he wasn't a particularly hands-on father. He was much too busy doing other things. And he did seem a bit remote at times, but we were just conscious of all this extremely clever work going on behind the barrage of books, the encyclopedias and things in his study. So many of the comments, in fact, virtually all of them, were published without consulting him, were completely condemnatory, and they came from people who hadn't bothered to read his work or try and understand his position at all, and he got extremely frustrated over that. So as I say, things were a bit difficult at that time.
And certainly, you and I showed, and, my last book, The Holy Mushroom, wouldn't have been possible without your direct and regular involvement in it, and I thank you for that. And in there, we clearly showed that many of the attacks that have been even within the entheogen community accepted as common fact about John were in fact fabricated and held no bearing whatsoever. Even the attacks against him, especially by R. Gordon Wasson. And so anyway, I just wanted to mention that and say thank you for all of your help and your contributions in helping this other side of the story that wasn't told for the last 40 years finally get out to the public.
Oh, well, thank you for asking me. It was an honor to work with you, and really you uncovered things I had no idea were going on, and aspects of the story that I didn't know existed. So I was pleased to be able to help in any way.
All right, so, well, you talked a little bit about who was John Marco Allegro, and so why was he so controversial? Why don't you start off with the Dead Sea Scrolls and then work into his later work?
Right, well, the Dead Sea Scrolls was where he made his name. He was one of the first editors, and as you said, he was certainly the most controversial of the set. Why he was controversial was because he was always asking uncomfortable questions, which brought him into conflict with the religious and academic establishment of the day. These questions mostly came out of his study of the Dead Sea Scrolls and their significance for the development of Christianity, a topic that not many other of the editors were all that keen to go into, for fairly obvious reasons, since they were mostly Catholic or Lutheran priests. He enrolled on the Oriental Studies degree course, and he got a first, and he really took to it, particularly Hebrew and Arabic. After Manchester, he started a doctorate at Oxford University in biblical Hebrew dialects, but that didn't last very long either, because meanwhile the Dead Sea Scrolls had been discovered. This was about 1947-48, and the scholars over in Jerusalem who were looking after them found that fragments of scrolls were coming in such quantities they couldn't cope with the mass. They needed extra help sorting them out. Anyway, to cut it short, John hadn't been long at Oxford before he was invited to go and join the new Dead Sea Scrolls editing team in Jerusalem.
So, well, you mentioned that he was studying for the Methodist ministry, and a common rumor out there is that John was Jewish, and that is actually part of the reason why he made this attack against Christianity. Is that at all true?
He wasn't Jewish at all. No, he was brought up in sort of conventional Methodist church-going background. Now and then, I think he was more interested in church as a social place to meet other girls and have local dances and things like that.
Yeah.
That was while he was a youngster. but there's no Jewish influence at all.
And he was actually French and English, wasn't he?
Well, as far as my aunt, his sister, managed to trace it back, which wasn't very far, they think the name came from either French or Italian, and it was something to do with his maternal grandmother, paternal grandmother, having gone out to France to be a governess, and she has an affair with somebody called, or possibly called Allegro. They weren't even sure that was his real name. Came back with an illegitimate son, who was John Marco Sr., my father's own father. The grandmother died on the way back to England, and John Marco Sr. was brought up as an orphan in England, and eventually he became an officer in the First World War, and when he came back he set up a printing press in Carshalton, which is part of South London, got married, and John and his sisters were the result of that, see. And he'd emerge at meal times, and he'd emerge to talk things over with, or talk things at my mother from time to time. But he didn't come around to sharing much of it with me and my brother until much, much later. I'd say in the 1980s, when I used to go over and visit him in his home in Cheshire and talk about the work he was doing at the time, which was the continuation of the philological work that was his first love, really. So growing up with him, apart from this sense of awe at anything so clever going on in our house, and tremendous pride when he would get ready for his expeditions to the deserts of Jordan and fill the driveway with Land Rovers and camping gear and excavation gear and things that would make the neighbours wish they lived somewhere else. Those are the main impressions, really. Things, to be honest, got a bit difficult in the later years. Well, I was a teenager, as things usually do when you're a teenager anyway. But he'd published The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross by then, and was getting a great deal of criticism, which made everything rather strained and difficult in the house. But after that, I went off to university, and as I say, it was really quite several years later when I came back to following up his work more closely and getting to know him a bit better. So it's been a mixed experience. And
can you talk a bit more about the press and the things going on when The Sacred Mushroom was published?
Well, the phone was always ringing, and my mother would try to field the conversation and tell everybody he wasn't available whenever possible. John welcomed any intelligent comments. Anybody who really showed an interest, he would have them over to the house and talk to them for hours, take them around the local sites, talking all the way, deliver them back thoroughly bemused. But anybody who seemed to be following his way of thought, he would make the most of.